when we're looking at a culture where mental illness is challenging, addiction, many of us as good, kind Christians, we're not always prepared to handle those deep of challenges. Yeah. So what kind of resources can we look to help care for those? And a lot of those challenges take some specialized care and a Christian caring heart in order to meet some of those needs.
Well, friends, we are here for this week's culture segment. Those of you who have listened to the show for a long time, you need to just sit down, because we have got back in the seat here at the table our dear friend Travis Williams, who in researching, we saw that he has been on more than 20 episodes of the Boundless show, but it has been a hot minute. So welcome back, Travis.
Wow, Lisa, it is so good to be with everybody in Boundless. You guys are all dear to my heart, and so good to see you.
I know, it is very good to see you. I mean, every time I do see you, I think of the conversation that we had several times offline, I think at least once on the show, about the fabulous DC Talk overalls that you had back in the day. I mean, we're, kicking it Jesus style.
I actually found those. No joke. I hadn't seen those forever, and I found those just like last year in a box. And if I would have known and remembered, I should have brought those.
And you're probably going to gift them to one of your kids, I hope.
They are Christian culture locked in time.
They are.
I love them.
They're probably auctionable at some level. So, well, when he is not, and I mean, he's always fashionable, let's be honest, but when he is not just basically running on the cusp of fashion, Travis is currently, he used to be here at Focus on the Family, and he has a long history in donor relations, in banking, in financial advisement, all of that. But he is currently right here in Colorado Springs, serving as the interim CEO. He's also the chief development officer at the Springs Rescue Mission here in town. And so I don't even know, John and I were trying to think about, how did we come up with this idea? I feel like it was about a day and a half ago, and we were like, get Travis in here and we're going to talk about it. Because what we want you to talk about today, and we want to learn from you, Travis, is what does it look like, really a biblical construct, to care for the poor and the needy among us? And now that could be the person right down the street. It could be, there are a number of people. It could be a class of people in your city. It could be a situational. It could be people in your church. There are just a lot of avenues. And I think we tend to do one of two extremes. We either freak out and don't help anyone, or we go way, we think, well, I'm a Christian, I better do whatever. And all of a sudden we don't know what we're doing.
Right.
So we need you to lend some expertise to this. So I want you to start out, because some people hear Springs Rescue Mission, and of course this is Colorado Springs, but what would you say, many cities, certainly in the U.S. and possibly even worldwide, have what they would call rescue missions, or the places for folks that are known in the city where people can go, they can get help, they can kind of get training, different things. What's the origin of that presence in a city? And maybe what is the purpose today of having something like that in a city, and or specifically in Colorado Springs even?
Yeah. Great question. And so regardless of where you are as a Boundless listener, odds are there is some organization, a Christian organization, that is leaning in to help folks that are struggling, often with poverty, homelessness, and or addiction. Mm-hmm. And many of those will go under the name Rescue Mission, but like many ministries today, they're all changing their name into Hope something or that. So you may have to look under the covers to find out what they are, but they're all doing some type of similar work. Many of those, in fact, there's about 300 of those that gather under an association umbrella. So we learn from each other, we grow from one another, but they're all independently operated. And so everyone's going to have their own different flavor, and sometimes even as a Christian organization, their own different expression of how they're sharing the gospel, either at their shelter or outreach center, and how they even express that out in the community. So they fill a vital role. And one of the big things is that we can all see is that homelessness tends to be on the rise across the United States. There are very few cities that are seeing declines in homelessness. Now, Colorado Springs, we happen to be one of those few cities that actually are seeing a decrease in homelessness. So as we look at the many organizations that are serving, many of those are actually looking to Springs Rescue Mission today to say, maybe what are some of the factors that are contributing to some of the success of helping folks struggling with homelessness, poverty, and addiction.
Yeah. So speaking of factors, let's back it up and talk about, because again, I alluded to the fact that, if the average person thinks of, oh, who do I know that is struggling with poverty or addiction or whatever? It's so easy in today's culture to think that that is a part of town, or that is a sector of society, or it's not as much like, oh, this is my next door neighbor, or if it is, we don't know. And so what would you say is most contributing to the struggles that the average community would see? And what role are you seeing churches even having in kind of being among those who are struggling? Really kind of give us an idea of what the landscape looks like.
A great question. And I would venture that just by Boundless listeners today, that if I were to say who on this show, and we could see everybody's hands go up, who on the show knows somebody who's either struggled with homelessness, struggled with poverty, or is currently struggling or has struggled with addiction, that so many hands would go up. And I think that's one of the challenges that we see, is that all of these things are not just dedicated to one part of town. It's already in the church. It's already in your families. That's why I see so many people reaching out to organizations like ours to say, how do we help? What does it look like to help? In fact, just even last week, I had some parents dropping off their daughter coming to the rescue mission. It's parents who don't know how to help their daughter with some of the mental illness that they're struggling with. And so when you look at homelessness, it can be a wide array of things. It can be mental illness. It can be addiction. But one of the things that I think that isn't talked about a lot is often the common denominator for everybody that often will show up at a shelter is broken relationships. Folks don't tend to be on the streets if they have any place else to go, right? And so it might be that the broken relationship happened because of mental illness. It might be because of addiction. It might be that just family tried everything that they could, but they couldn't do any more. They were at the end of their rope. And so these are some of the things that I think contribute to the challenges that we see in society. And then I'm sure you can ask a great question of what can we do about that?
Yeah, well, it's true. And I mean, I do. So really you're saying, I mean, I think a lot of times we go back to, stories we've read from 100 to 300 years ago or whatever. And maybe Charles Dickens, that's what we remember. We think of people being thrown into debtor's prison or whatever. But really modern contributors tend to be drug addiction, homelessness because of lack of family relationship, all of that mental illness, some of that. So is that, again, talking about this divide that we have, what's your recommendation for Christians who have a heart, want to have a heart to care, see it in Scripture? I mean, I'm looking in Leviticus, where it starts out by talking about don't glean the edge of your fields, leave the edge for the poor and the foreigner. And we know that was the story of Ruth, how she, that was captured in her own story, all the way to lending to people without interest, giving freely, so all of that is so important. But how do we do this in a way that that people who are struggling, people who are needy, people who maybe we don't even know, are seen as people made in the image of God and not projects that we need to check off a list because we're Christians and we ought to be doing this?
Right. I love the entire setup there. And some of the things that I look at is I always go to Scripture, right? I mean, obviously, Scripture has so much to say about caring for those that are in need. So a couple of things. Number one, I always go to love your neighbor as you would love yourself. I think that's a big piece of all of this work. The second thing, though, that I think Jesus makes it really hard is he says, love those who aren't like you, who may not even be like you,
Right.
and who may not even like you.
Right.
Right? So love your enemies as you love yourself. And for many folks who are struggling with mental illness, addiction, homelessness, even as Christians, I see it that sometimes it's like, I can love some hard people, but those are hard people to love. But I would say those are the folks that we need to lean into. And those are the folks that maybe God is challenging us even in a different way than even maybe that struggling neighbor across the street. The piece that I often will look to for guidance on this is the parable of the Good Samaritan, right? The parable of the Good Samaritan. You've got the wounded person who's beat up, and you've got what's interesting about that story. You've got a couple of religious leaders who just pass on by, and then you've got this Samaritan who was not considered anything of value and even despised in many of the cultures of that day. That's the one who stops. And Jesus is giving this illustration. And so when I look at this, I go, there's something in there. The person, the Samaritan, he stopped. So maybe the first thing we need to do is simply see the person, stop, and then do something, right? So the Samaritan saw that there was somebody hurting. They stopped. Now, what's fascinating about this, and then I think that sometimes as Christians, we often think, well, the parable of the Good Samaritan is all about me and what I do, and it is. But if you look at what Jesus said was a Good Samaritan, it wasn't that the Samaritan took that person, brought him to his home, took care of him, fed him, did all the things. It was, no, the Good Samaritan took him to the inn. And the inn is what was doing the work. And so I often look at a place like a rescue mission as that inn. And maybe the best thing that Good Samaritan did was, again, see, stop, and what they did is take them to a place that can provide the care, and then they helped provide the resources so that person could get the care. When we're looking at a culture where mental illness is challenging, addiction, many of us as good, kind Christians, we're not always prepared to handle those deep of challenges. Yeah. So what kind of resources can we look to help care for those? And a lot of those challenges take some specialized care and a Christian caring heart in order to meet some of those needs.
Yeah, it makes me think how, there almost might be a sense of needing to check our motives in a self-righteous spirit of like, oh yeah, I'm just going to go all out. I'm going to crash and burn because I'm going to be an amazing Christian who's going to solve all the problems in my community, but recognizing that it really is, it's a problem maybe that is systemic through communities and whatnot, and it's something that certainly the church needs to step in, but we're not here to be kamikaze heroes and be, single ladies listening, you don't open up your home to every drug addict that comes through the park when you're running, and that's probably, there's some wisdom.
There is wisdom. Well. And I think, wisdom with kindness is really important. And in fact, I talk with many churches who say, oh, we want to start a homeless ministry, we want to do shelters. And I'll be like, you know what? You can, but know that it's actually really hard, that to care for even a few people that are experiencing homelessness, so many of your resources, so many of your energy are just going to go there. And what I will often say is partner with somebody like a rescue mission and allow the church often to be the church and to do so many other things that churches do. Because once somebody, like for us, we have programs that will help folks battle their addictions, find pathways to better employment, find housing. And when they leave the rescue mission, the one thing that's going to help them is being in community. So when there's a lack of relationships, how do we move people toward community? And that's where being a vibrant church and creating a great community full of relationships may be the smartest thing you can do as a local church to help somebody who's actually struggling with poverty and homelessness. It may not be starting your own specific homeless ministry. It might, but it might just be being the church and finding a good partner to partner with you. And the same goes, I would say, for individuals. Yeah.
So to that point, when you talk about community, I think one question that probably is at the back of everyone's mind is, okay, here's where, the rubber almost literally hits the road. I'm driving, I park at an or I stop at an intersection. Some dude is there, maybe with his adorable dog, and he's got a sign up that just says, anything will help. and this is where, we've been talking about all the people who are super aspirational, a really good best case scenario about the hearts of people. Then we'd look at the other side of us of like, immediately we're going to be judgy. We're going to be like, this person needs to get a job. We're going to
Right.
make up a story about them in our head. We're going to remember the news story we read that like panhandlers make 50 grand a year by doing
Right.
that. And we're like, ah. Talk about what it looks like for a Christian to wisely engage or not engage in that situation. And what does it look like to help that person, whether it's immediately or whether there's a better way to do that more holistically?
Right. No, great question. And again, every city is going to be a little bit different, and they're going to have a different context. But here's what I know about what we do at Springs Rescue Mission. I know that we have space for people. I know we provide 3 meals a day for people. I know we have access to showers, laundry service, job training. We have health services all on one campus. So whatever somebody has on their sign, I'm going Springs Rescue Mission can help.
Mm-hmm.
And so I can do this with confidence. I will actually, in fact, I just did this yesterday. I'll see somebody who's on the road. I'll roll down my window, and the first thing that I'll do is say, hey, man, what's your name? And very few people actually ask a homeless individual what their name is.
Sure.
And if you've ever talked to homeless individuals, many of them will have a code name.
Oh.
Be like, I'm Caveman, or I'm
Okay.
Sugar. And I'll be like, no. What's the name your mom gave you? And then they'll be, oh, I'm Jonathan. Be like, Jonathan, hey man, have you ever been down to the rescue mission? Well, and there might be some excuses there. And I'll be like, well, listen, thousands of people in this community actually love you, and they're providing a bed for you, shelter for you. They're providing food for you, and you don't have to be here. And what I found is that sometimes the first knee-jerk reaction will be, well, maybe if you're either going to drive by or you're going to try and like grab some money. Sometimes giving money isn't the wisest thing to do, because what can happen in that situation is you're not going to change somebody's life by giving them $5, right? In fact, what you may do is end up delaying their progress, because now I've got $5 or $10 or $20, whatever I was able to get, and I'm able to go to McDonald's and then hole up along a camp someplace. And what I found is that nobody gets better in isolation. So by giving sometimes that handout, you're isolating somebody and keeping them further away from positive relationships that could actually start transforming their life. So again, what I would say the smartest thing to do in many situations, you can do whatever you want to. I don't want to change anybody's heart or what God's telling them to do. But what we've found is that just simply acknowledging the individual, treating them like a human being as God sees them, and pointing them to the resources versus feeling like I'm going to change somebody's life right there on the street corner. And we recognize, and I think if you think about it long enough, you're probably not going to change that person's life. And in fact, you may end up hurting them longer. So being compassionate takes a lot of wisdom. And there's such more research on that today, like toxic charity or toxic empathy. Some of these things that can make us as Christians feel good about ourselves, like I did something. But you may have inadvertently, through what you thought was an act of kindness, end up hurting somebody.
Yeah. Okay. No, great point. Okay, I want you to answer, and then I actually want to just talk more generally about what I alluded to at the beginning about just generosity, Christians and generosity in general, and just the scriptures that are there that talk about what it looks like for us to be open-handed in a lot of situations. But I do want to ask specifically when it comes to the poor, the mentally ill, those who are struggling, who are homeless in a city. What would you say the person who right now is like, okay, but what can I do? What would be a first step to getting more information, to figuring out how can I plug in, how can I use my heart and my giftedness to start making a difference? What would your first recommendation be?
First recommendation is take time to assess. What does your community already have? So often as Christians we go, well, I don't see anything. I must start something. Well, that may be what you need to do, but oftentimes I would recommend see what's actually already in your community. Go talk to a service provider. See how you might be able to help. They may need volunteers. Again, every rescue mission is going to be a little bit different. Some are able to fundraise well enough to get staff. Some need a lot of volunteers. Some just need you to bring some resources, and it could be bottles of water, it could be food, it could be clothing, some of those practical things. But it starts with really assessing where is your community and what are the needs that are there, and finding those kind of partners. Oftentimes, what many of the organizations need is, if you're able to financially support them, right? I mean, just kind of the parable of the Good Samaritan is, I may not be able to do everything, but I can help this person who's struggling get access to the resources and make sure that there's a place for them to lay their head, where they can be in relationship with folks who love them and care about them, believers who will be able to meet some of the practical needs, but also the spiritual needs that folks are having. Lisa, I think this is an important thing just to even say, is that as much as we talk about poverty, mental illness, so many of the folks that I see that are homeless, they're struggling with purpose. But then I will talk, what's interesting about a position like mine is I will also talk with some of the wealthiest people in this community, and they're also struggling with purpose. And so it reminds me of that proverb too, is rich or poor, God is the maker of them all, right? Many of the folks that we're serving are struggling with many of the same things that other folks in this community are struggling with. And so you just have different challenges. So maybe you can help somebody with a different challenge by, again, assessing the situation, considering how you might be able to help that organization, and where at all possible, financially supporting those kind of organizations so that people can thrive.
Yeah. Just makes me think too that there might be someone who could be that liaison between their church maybe and a local mission, or another group that's working already on the ground. I know my church partners with Springs Rescue Mission, and it's always great to get the updates and hear about, okay, what did our teams go and do, and what have we been involved in? And so you might be that person that kind of even raises awareness in your own church to make that happen.
Be a champion at your church. That's an important thing.
Yeah.
How can you rally people? Because it's not an easy cause, and generosity is not easy.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the things that I learned is generosity is not, like if I were, again, asking people in a room, who's generous? Well, some hands would go up, but deep in their heart, they go, God hasn't blessed me with generosity. So sometimes as
No,
Christians,
that's not me.
we have to kind of lean into that. And I think there's a piece of that I think God is stretching our faith.
Yeah.
He's stretching those who may not be experiencing those challenges and saying, you know what, you're struggling with purpose as well. Perhaps your purpose is to care for somebody else so that they can begin to find their purpose. And I think there's something beautiful there.
Well, and that's really kind of where I want to land, because, you can be wealthy and miserly, and you can be poor and very generous. And as Christians, we're called to be good stewards of what God has given us, which isn't even ours, it's His. We're just, keeping it for a time and hopefully using it for His glory. And so just that, any encouragement you have, I think of, you were referencing the wealthy, and I'm like, it's so all of us are wealthy by someone's standard.
Right.
And it's very easy for tribes to gather together and like to be with like, and us to just hang out with our, venti latte and stuff and talk to our friends and whatever. But man, just going through some scriptures as I was this morning, and the whole concept of what does it look like for me to see someone in need and just give, to start looking through my stuff and what can I give? What do I have things, multiples of, that I just don't need? We tend to have a hoarding mindset, even as believers. And what does it look like for me to truly decide that I'm going to lend to a friend without asking for interest or anything in return and stuff? And I just think it's encouraging. We're all going to think that because of what you do every day, Travis is an expert at this. He's only, this is him 24/7. But really, it's for all of us to do as God calls us, I would say.
I think so. And that's the great thing. Going back to that parable of the Good Samaritan, is you don't know a lot about that inn, right? And I'll say that the inns are maybe those rescue missions in your local community, but what the story is about, it's the person. It's God wants us to lean into those things. And that's what, Jesus is talking, and his, the question was, what must I do to have eternal life? And then Jesus gives that parable, and he says, go and do likewise, right? And so it's really about each of us as individuals. And even as an expert in this, I struggle with this. I have to live this out every day. And that might be just another encouragement, is that many people feel like in order to make a difference in this world, they need to get on a plane and go on a big mission trip someplace. Mm-hmm. I would say for some of you, you may just need to get in your car and go downtown.
Yeah.
And see the mission field that's standing right before you, because there's poverty that exists in, if you live in the United States, if you live in another country that is doing fairly well, there are still challenges in each community. And even if you travel internationally, the challenges are all local challenges. Right. And so how do we, even as local individuals, do some work locally so that we can have influence globally?
Yeah. That's such a good word. And man, we're heading, at least here in the Northern Hemisphere, heading into winter. We're heading into the holiday season. We're going to cross over into the new year. And the needs are always present, you guys. So maybe this is a great wake-up call for all of us to be reminded of this. So we'll have info. You might even want to check out Springs Rescue Mission, which is at springsrescuemission.org, to see what they're doing. And we're going to have all the links and info about Travis, his entire personal life and what's going on, the latest bands he's joined, whatever. We'll have that in our show notes as well, so you can check it out. But Travis, thanks again for this conversation. Such a joy to see what God has you doing now in the world, and hopefully we're all going to be inspired as well.
Well, thank you, and thank you to all the Boundless listeners. And maybe I'll close with this: go and do likewise.
Yep.